Okay, so that's now finished exporting. So we can close Houdini. If we take a look at our export directory, you can see now we have this new skeletal mesh version of our character. This is the one we're going to bring into Unreal Engine, as opposed to our static mesh that we brought into Substance Painter. We also have all of the textures that Houdini discovered on our character have been copied into this textures folder. Now, this isn't necessarily every texture that the character used in DazToHue. Often it is, but not always. It kind of depends on how the character's materials were set up in DazToHue. There's no standard material definitions for FBX, so it very much varies from application to application in terms of how they interpret FBX materials, both when exporting and importing. But anyway, we're going to be using some of these textures in Unreal Engine for our character. I also went ahead and brought various other textures together as well, just in case we want to use them. So Genesis 9 in DazToHue comes with a whole lot of, I guess, base Genesis 9 textures. And I found that often content creators in DazToHue will use, for example, the normal maps that Daz provides for Genesis 9 rather than creating their own custom normal maps. You'll see here this character doesn't have any normal maps for its skin in this exported directory. So we may end up using some of the normal maps that come with the base Genesis 9 characters. I also have this character's original textures. You can see there's 57 original textures, but there's only 39 that Houdini has discovered. That's because there's different textures for eyes, etc., genitalia that we are using on this character, so it hasn't brought them across. And also just have some various makeup textures that we may or may not get to when we're putting our characters' materials together. So now it's time to jump into Unreal Engine and begin creating materials for our character. So here we are inside Unreal Engine. The only preparation I've done so far is just to create a blank directory structure that I'm going to use for texturing or for creating materials for our character. You'll see here I did a test run earlier. Just ignore that. That's just something for me to refer to as I go, so I don't spend too much time fiddling with material parameters in this tutorial. Before we get started though, there's a couple of tips that I found really helpful when I was starting out on creating materials for my own characters. The first tip is that when it comes to creating good looking character materials, lighting is as much a part of the end result as the materials themselves. So it's really helpful to have some scenes with ideally calibrated lighting scenarios in them, and having a mix of different lighting scenarios so that you can see how your character's materials hold up under different lighting situations. There's a bunch of ways you can get these sorts of scenes, but my go-to recently has been this MetaHuman lighting content. You can download this for free from the Epic Marketplace. And it is exactly that. It's a bunch of blank scenes with different lighting scenarios in them. And I found it really useful, as I say, for testing how my character's materials were holding up in different situations. So I'd highly recommend you download this content and add it to your project. And the second tip is that I found it helpful to actually have a metahuman in my project that I could refer to as I was putting my own characters' materials together. So I have this Bernice metahuman here. And despite whatever other criticisms I might have about metahumans, I do think the materials that come with them are fantastic and a good reference point for creating your own materials for your Daz figures. So that's just something to be aware of as well if you are able to have a metahuman that is somewhat similar to your Daz character that you're aiming for. It can be a helpful reference point. So whatever you do, don't try and create your materials on, say, this standard third level blueprint scene. It's not the ideal lighting scenario. What I'm going to do is use one of those metahuman lighting scenes that I've downloaded and added to my project. You can see they come in different flavors. We have ray tracing, we have non-ray tracing and image-based lighting. And it's helpful, as I say, to test your materials across as many of these as you can. I'm going to be using this, basically this non-ray traced portrait scene to do the bulk of our material work for this character. You can see it just has more or less your standard studio lighting, various key lights and a top light. It comes with the post-process volume in place, so we can tweak things like exposure levels, which we may want to do as well. Okay, so let's get started. We'll dive into this blank folder structure that I set up, and I'm going to import our character. So we want the skeletal mesh version, not the static mesh version that we used for Substance Painter. I'm going to import that. On the import options, I'll just scroll through slowly so you can see there's nothing unusual going on here. When we get to materials, you'll see I'm telling it to not create any materials on import. Unreal Engine does a terrible job at creating materials on import. As I said before, that's largely because there's no standard way of defining materials in FBX. And certainly Unreal Engine doesn't do a great job when it comes to character skin material. It will put the wrong textures in the wrong channels, for example. You'll end up having to redo the whole materials from scratch anyway, so I'm just going to tell it to not import them, and we'll create them ourselves. The only thing I do need to change is I'm going to target the Genesis 9 archetype skeleton, and then we'll just import. Okay, so that's finished importing. We can close this log. The first thing I'm going to do is just drag the character out into our scene and center it. I'm going to come up to this show menu under sprites. I'm going to hide all sprites just to clean up the viewport a bit. You can see our character there with no materials assigned to it. What I might also do, remember I mentioned that it's kind of handy when you're starting out to have a good reference point. I'm going to find our metahuman, also drag that into the scene and just position it so it's roughly next to our character. So what I'm going to do now, again, I found it helpful to, when it comes to putting materials together, it's helpful to understand roughly how they work under the hood. So if I come up to this lit menu under buffer visualization, I'm going to select overview. What this is doing is showing us all of the render buffers that Unreal Engine is currently using. And you can see that for a lot of them, we have some data in them, both for our metahuman and our DAZ figure. And without wanting to delve too deeply into all of this, because this is a beginner's tutorial, I found it helpful to refer to these buffers by referencing what each buffer was showing on the metahuman and trying to get my DAZ character to look somewhat similar. And these are both using subsurface profile skin shaders in Unreal Engine. And you'll see that the buffers it uses are base color, which is our overall skin color, specular, which is kind of like the reflectivity or specular highlights on the skin. It's using world normals, which is just our character's normal maps. And if you look closely at metahumans, for example, you can see it has very good normal maps, and they go a long way to selling this sort of micro bump detail in the skin. Currently our DAZ figure has basically just perfectly smooth normals, no normals at all. Opacity, insofar as the skin material is concerned, governs how much the subsurface scatter weight, or how the subsurface scatter weight appears on the material. So darker values mean there's less subsurface scattering. Lighter values means there's more. Roughness is that it's kind of, broadly speaking, how rough the skin is. So darker values mean it's less rough, so it'll show more specular highlights, for example. Your lips are typically darker than the rest of the skin because They are typically wetter, shinier than the rest of the skin. So they're the main buffers we're going to be, I guess, referring to as we put our materials together. Base color, specular, normals, opacity to a lesser degree, and roughness. And obviously in the center we get all the buffers combined into our final rendered image. So I just wanted to point that out, that referring to these buffers, I found at least, is very helpful, as helpful as just referring to the end result, particularly when you have something that is pretty good that you can reference when you're putting your own materials together. All right, enough of that. So let's get started. What I'm going to do is I'm going to expand the DazToHue content under common materials. We have various categories. We have a cloth, we have our eyes, which also includes things like the tear line or that lacrimal fluid material I was telling you about. I'm not going to worry about hair for this tutorial. We also have a packed skin material. There's actually two versions or two different skin materials included with DazToHue. We're going to be using the the MI skin material. The packed version is basically designed for doing a whole lot of work offline and bringing in just the finished textures. It's far more optimized. It has far fewer material instructions, but it basically requires you to do all this work offline. I typically use Substance Designer for that. But as this is a beginner tutorial, we're going to use MI skin as our skin material. If we open it, you'll see it has a bunch of different categories. It's basically a two-layered system, although it is all done in the one material. By that I mean Unreal Engine has a material layering system, but I aren't using it for this setup. The layering system is very powerful. You can create very complicated setups with it, but it's less optimized and I think more complicated for beginners to grasp. So I ended up doing it this way. And you can see we basically have a base skin layer with various different parameters on it. You'll see the categories roughly match the buffers that I talked about earlier. And then we also have a secondary layer, which is for things like makeup, tattoos, paint, anything like that that sits above the skin layer. We'll cover that as we go. So to get started, I never work with the original materials. Always create copies of them in your character's materials folder. So we'll start with the cloth. I'm just going to create a copy of this MI cloth material. Copy that to our character's material folder. Under the eyes, I'm going to grab MI eye. Copy that to our character's material folder. Same for the lacrimal fluid. We'll copy that over. I don't have the eye occlusion geometry on this character, so I'm going to leave that. Finally, the skin, I'm going to grab MI skin, copy that into our character's materials folder. And for now, I'll just go back to the full lit view. So the first thing I'm going to do is rename these. It's up to you to come up with your own naming convention, but if we have a look at the skeletal mesh quickly, in fact, we'll keep it open here. You'll see we have the material slots that match what we set up in Houdini, and they're in the order that we had them in Houdini. And if you name your materials the same name as these material slots, then the next time you have to re-import this character, if you do, it will automatically discover these materials and automatically assign them to your character. And obviously you can share materials across characters, so if you make sure the names match, it will automatically, as I say, assign all the materials it discovers if they match. So it's kind of a useful time-saving feature. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this cloth material as I'm basically going to rename it to that. And then I'm going to duplicate it and create another one for our top. Our eyes, I'm going to rename our eye material. Our tear line material will be our lacrimal fluid material. And the skin, I'm not going to rename to match any of these. I'm going to just call it KT9 skin. Now, the reason for doing that is because I find it useful to have a base skin material that is the parent of all the other skin materials we are going to create for this character. The reason for that is that if I need to change a parameter globally across, say, our head, arms, legs, body material, I can do it at this base level, and that will apply to all of them. Likewise, I can override any parameters defined on this base level for each of the individual skin materials. That will make more sense as we go. So what I'm going to do now is right-click this skin material and create material instance. This one I'm going to rename to match one of our slots. So in this case, we'll call it KT9 head. Now I can duplicate that for the body. Duplicate again for the arms, and once more for the legs. Now all of those four materials, arms, body, head, legs, are now all referring to this parent, this master parent skin material. And we can check that if we open one of these up. Scroll down to the bottom, we'll see its parent is now that KT9 skin material. So now that we have just our blank material set up, it's time to assign them to the slots on our character. So we'll start with the eyes. I'll leave nails for now, we'll come back to that. This tutorial is primarily focused on skin and eyes, but we might touch on the others as well in a second part. So we'll leave nails, we'll bring legs across, arms, head, body. We'll leave the mouth as well for now. Tear. And then our clothing top and bottom. And we can save this now. Now we can close that, and basically this is the starting point. So we now have all our base materials created and assigned to our character. Now it's just a matter of tweaking them to get it to look good, basically. So let's just quickly start with the eyes. I don't want to go into the eye shader too much. There's other documentation online. As I say, it is more or less the MetaHuman eye shader. So if you open up our eye material, just bring it to the side so we can see its parameters along with our character in the viewport. The main settings I tend to change on this are the color, so the iris color. So if you tick those four on, we can tweak the iris color. So if we wanted blue, for example, we can play with these parameters to get blue eyes. You can cover the full gamut of human eye colors with these sliders. There's both. So the first one is more the internal part, the inside of the iris, and then the second one is the outside of the iris. So you can do blends between them as well. Let's just go with simple blue eyes for now. The other thing you might want to play around with is this iris UV scale. So if in Daz the eyes look larger, more like that, you can change that here. And there's also the pupil scale, if you want the eyes to be more or less dilated. So we'll leave the eyes like that. I don't want to spend too much on the eyes because I'm going to say the bulk of this tutorial is about the skin itself. If we open up our master's skin material, and we'll just quickly have a look at some of the settings on there. Obviously, without any textures, it doesn't look great. It's just a wax-like dummy looking thing. Can change things like the color if you want, but you will typically want textures to get anything close to a realistic looking character. So I'm also going to open each of our different skin materials. So we'll open the head, body, arms, and legs. So we now have all of them open on this window. We can work across them all. So at the very least, in order to get something resembling a reasonable looking character, we're going to want to bring in some color textures. So if I go to our characters textures that were exported out of Houdini, I'm going to grab the _D textures. Now, Daz content creators, there doesn't seem to be any consistent naming convention when it comes to Daz content creators. Different textures will have different naming conventions. I've seen _D, which presumably means diffuse, as in diffuse color. I've seen _color. I've seen all sorts of naming conventions. AO is typically ambient occlusion. B is often bump. R is presumably roughness. There's various others as well. That's part of the homework you'll have to sort of figure out yourself in terms of determining which textures you want to bring in. And again, referring back to our buffers, which textures are going to work best in which buffer, basically. So anyway, let's start by bringing in our diffuse textures. So we have the body here, the arms, the head, and the legs. So I'm just going to drag those to my characters textures folder. Now, I myself would always rename these and follow a consistent naming convention. I'm not going to do that for the purposes of this tutorial. I'll leave that up to you to figure out your own conventions and organizational structures. All right, so we have our color textures brought in. If you start with our head, what we need to do is enable use base color texture. And we have to tick it 3 times. It's just a weird quirk of how Unreal Engine material parameters work. So it's once to enable base color texture again, and then another time to enable the actual texture sampling slot. It's a little weird, but it's the way it is. Now we can drag our base color into that slot, and you'll see immediately things start looking much better. We'll do the same for the body. Same for the arms. And once more for the legs. So you can see a huge difference from just having a base color texture and nothing else. We start to get something resembling our Daz as it was, our character as it was in DazToHue. Now, if we bring up our buffers again, the way I built this material was for it to be forgiving for those that are either new to it all or didn't want to spend a whole lot of time working on materials. And so you'll notice that even though we've only supplied it with the base color texture, we do have data in most of the other buffers as well. So we have some data in specular, some in roughness, and some in opacity, which remember is our subsurface scatter weight buffer. We don't yet have anything in normals at the moment though. And the way this works is that if you don't provide it any of these other buffer textures, it will derive some data from the base color. So it's basically taking the luminance of the base color channel, using it to derive some specular and roughness data. And they're basically the inverse of each other, as well as the subsurface scatter weight. So that's why with nothing other than base color textures, you get what I would consider reasonable results. Long way to go yet, but passable, and certainly a lot better than anything that Unreal Engine would auto-generate for you on import. So let's keep those buffers up actually, and we'll kind of work through them one by one. So I think the next critical thing to add would be normal maps, because nothing is derived from the base color when it comes to normals. So we will want to import some, and they will help to add little micro surface details like we can see on the metahumans here. I will say that the normal maps that come with most Daz characters aren't anywhere near as good as metahumans, but they certainly do help. So if we go back to our characters' textures, remember this is the textures that Houdini discovered for us. We actually don't have any normal maps for the skin part of our character. This character is actually unusual in that it didn't seem to use any normal maps in DazToHue. Instead it was using bump maps, but we want to actually use actual normal maps. So what I'm going to do is come to where I sort of collated these other textures together. I'm going to go to where I had the base Genesis 9 textures, and there's 4 flavors for both feminine and 4 for masculine. I'm going to use feminine 3, and I'm going to use the normal maps found in here for our character. We have a look at the head. You can see the normal maps there. Now, obviously this character is quite young looking, so we don't want normal maps that have, for example, deep wrinkle lines on them. Wouldn't really fit this character. The thing to point out here is that providing that the UVs match across textures, then you are free to use really any textures from any character, anywhere you can find, to get the best result. So here I'm going to, as I say, borrow the normal maps from the base Genesis 9 Feminine 3 set and use those for our character. So I come back to our textures. I'm going to grab the normal map for the arms, the body, head and legs, and bring those into Unreal Engine. And let's bring up just the world normals on their own so we can get a look at what's going on. At the moment we don't have any normal maps in this buffer. We come to our head material, go to the second category, which is the base normal category, and it's something similar. We're going to enable normal texture. I'm going to drag our head normals into there, and now you can see we have some data in our world normal buffer for our head. I'm going to do the same for the body and for the arms, and finally for the legs. You can now see, for example, metahumans, skin normal maps, and this particular Daz skin normal map. If we bring back our lit view and look closely, you will see we are starting to get some normal micro bumps in this skin. It's a little hard to see. One of the things we might want to do is increase the strength of this normal map a bit. But a lot in terms of getting this sort of detail that you can see on the metahuman isn't all about normals. A lot of it comes from the specular and roughness channels as well. So we're going to leave the normal maps like that and populate the rest of the channels and then start tweaking from there. I think might be the best way to go. So let's see if we can find some roughness and specular textures. So this is again our characters' textures. Underscore R, we do have roughness textures, which are these underscore R textures. So let's bring those in. We're going to bring our body, head, legs, and arms in. Now, if you bring up our buffers again, you'll notice that so the specular and roughness buffers are grayscale values. So they expect data between 0 and 1, whereas say base color is a colored value. So it has red, green, and blue values, as does world normals. So our material setup here expects these textures to be linear grayscale. So what we want to do is open them. Let's make this a bit bigger so we can see what's going on. We'll open each of them. And then under compression settings for these, I'm going to change it to grayscale. And then I'm going to untick sRGB. I don't want to get into the reasons for this particular thing. I don't fully understand it myself, but basically this will make them linear as opposed to sRGB. We want linear grayscale, so by unticking that, we're getting the linear, and by changing the compression settings, we're getting a linear grayscale texture that the material expects. So I'm going to do that for each of them. Grayscale, linear, grayscale, linear, and once more. And I can save all of those. We can close the textures now. We'll keep our materials open. So now let's bring up our roughness buffer on its own. Now we'll start with our head again. We'll come down to the roughness layer. We want to again tick 3 times to enable the roughness texture sampler. We'll bring our head roughness in. We'll do the same for our body. Same for our arms. And finally for our legs. So you can see our roughness is quite a bit lighter than the metahumans, which means that our skin will look less shiny than the metahumans. That may be fine. Again, skin is a weird thing in nature. How shiny it is depends on various things, age, ethnicity, that sort of thing. So you don't necessarily need to match the metahuman exactly, but again, I think it's a useful sort of reference point as well. So what we can do now is come back to our base skin material, and we find the roughness, base layer roughness, and we can tick base roughness adjustments. And that'll let us tweak these roughness values a little bit. So what we can do is, for example, play with the contrast to just darken that roughness channel a little bit, get it something closer to metahuman, but not exactly. Keep an eye on the lit view. We can see that the darker we make it, the shinier the skin looks. We obviously don't want to go that far. So I think a value around about 1.5 will do for now. And again, because we made that change at the base skin material and we haven't overwritten those adjustments on any of the other materials, that change will apply to all of our skin materials on our character. So now let's think about the specular channel. Let's see if we have any specular textures we can work with. So I can't see any actual obvious specular textures that were exported out of Houdini. We do have ambient occlusion, which we might be able to use in a pinch. Generally for specular, you want quite a bit of detail in the texture, get the best results. Roughness, you can get away with less detail. If we have a look at the metahuman again, we can see its specular texture is quite detailed. Its roughness less so. As I say, we don't seem to have any that came exported out of Houdini, any specular textures. So let's have a look at the source textures for this character, because it's possible they weren't picked up by Houdini. Yeah, so in the source textures, I can see we do have these SP textures, which I'm assuming is specular. They are very dark, but we can probably fix that in Unreal Engine. So I'm going to bring those in and just see how they look like when they're assigned to our specular buffer. So let's bring those across. Now, like we did with the roughness textures, these also need to be linear grayscale. So I'm going to need to open all of these and change them. Compression to grayscale and untick sRGB. Save all of those. Now let's bring up our specular buffer. Let's start assigning those. So if we find our base layer specular category, I'm going to enable the texture, and we'll drag our head in. You can see it there. Do the same for our body. And our arms. And finally our legs. So we can now see we have specular data in there. As you can see, it's a lot darker than the original, the MetaHuman reference. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Let's go back to our lit view and take a look at that. You can start to see now at glancing angles we're getting this nice detail. It's a combination of the normal map and the specular and roughness that are just sort of catching these highlights on the skin. You'll see something similar on the metahumans, albeit the textures are a lot better done in my opinion. These are obviously created by an artist as opposed to just derived from making normal maps and that sort of thing. But it's looking pretty good. So now that we have those in place, we can come back. Remember I said we might want to increase the normal map strength because it is quite soft. So if we come back to our base skin material, find the normal layer and turn on normal adjustments, we can try increasing the strength of the normal maps a little. You don't want to go crazy like that. You might want to just bump them up a little bit. We want things to be subtle still, but a little bit more detail in there. Okay, so let's bring up our buffers again now, and we're gonna focus on specular now that we've increased our normal map strength a little bit. I don't like that this specular buffer is so dark compared to the MetaHuman reference. It basically means that the specular highlights aren't really popping how I'd like them on the rest of the skin. You can see in the MetaHuman we're getting these nice highlighted edges, whereas for ours we are getting some of that, but not quite as much. So on our base skin material, because we want to apply this globally to all the skin parts on our character, going to enable base specular adjustments. Make sure that these three are enabled, so the min, max, and the contrast. And we're going to bring the minimum up a bit, so it can't be any less than, say, 0.25 to get it closer to the range of the MetaHuman. And the contrast we're going to drop a bit because we've now lost a lot of that detail that we had in there. By dropping the contrast, we're going to get some of that back. I think a value of around 0.5 would be good. You now start to see there, from a values point of view, they are closer to each other. If you have a look at our lit view again, starting to get some nice specular highlights. Might bring the maximum down a little bit so that we don't want the lips to get too overblown, something like 0.75. What we might do, as I mentioned right at the start of our Unreal Engine part of this tutorial, we might see how it looks under some different lighting scenarios. If I come to this moonlight map, for example, bring our character in and center it. You can see now how she's looking under a completely different lighting scenario. I think it holds up pretty well. Let's try it on some others. We have this firelight scenario. Obviously very orange firelight. Looks pretty good. Let's try one of these others, Downtown Night, which is using image-based lighting only. I think works quite well in terms of being integrated into the rest of the environment. So I think we're getting close to the point where I'm happy with our base layer of skin materials. There are a couple of parameters I haven't talked about yet. Occlusion will come to when we do the inside of the mouth. It's basically a way of brute forcing ambient occlusion in cavities. So when the mouth is open on the character, without a dedicated occlusion texture, it will look too light inside the mouth. As I say, we'll cover that probably in a later video. Wrinkle maps only relates to really, at the moment, the head material. It drives just at the wrinkle maps when the character's face is animating. I'm not going to cover that in this tutorial. The fuzz category we will take a quick look at. So if we bring up our roughness channel, what you'll often notice, it's basically a way of simulating the kind of what they call peach fuzz, the really fine hairs on human skin that kind of catch the light at glancing angles. What it basically does is it reduces the roughness on glancing angles of our character, depending on where the camera is. So if I enable it, you might see, or you might notice that now on the edges of our character, on those glancing angles, the roughness has gotten darker, and we can adjust the intensity of that. If we bring back our lit view, you'll see now on those glancing angles, our skin is less rough. Now that is too much. You want to be very subtle with this, and you can control. I'll bring back our roughness so we can see what's actually going on. You can control two other parameters, which basically to do with how large that transition is. It's using the Fresnel node under the hood, if you know what that is. So play around with those parameters until you get something that you like. To say that's too much. You want it to be very subtle. And yeah, you just want to sort of catch some of those edge highlights without going too crazy, without the skin looking too wet. So there's that parameter, and the only other thing we really haven't looked at in this base layer is the physical tone settings. So to have a quick look at what they're doing on our master skin material, so as we want to apply this to all of our skin materials, I'm going to turn on use base color texture, and that'll allow us access to this use physical skin model. We're going to tick that on, and by default now our character's gone very orange looking. Now it's a little difficult to explain how this works. It's basically about being able to use the same set of textures across different characters and give them different skin tone variations without needing different textures for all of them. Basically, you just play around with these values here. This chromophore contribution parameter, basically the color should be close to what the base skin color is, because it basically strips the base skin color out so that you're just left with grayscale detail, and then you're putting the skin color back in using these melanin and hemoglobin parameters. Basically, you can just play with these sliders and you'll be able to get different human skin tones out of them. I don't want to go into too much detail. I don't fully understand the science behind it. I can leave a link to the paper that I took this data from and built this material from. It is online. And I do include it in my Discord channel as well if you're interested. But like I say, it's just a way of getting more mileage out of a single set of textures by being able to use the same textures across different characters and giving them different sort of ethnicities, if you like. But I'm going to turn that off for this character. And I'm going to call it there because it's already getting crazy long. In the next part, we will look at the secondary layer options, which, as I mentioned before, is about adding makeup or paint or scars or things like that on top of our base layer. So we'll come back to that in the next video. I'll see you then. Bye.